The prophet Ezekiel in the first reading today takes us to a cemetery. What a cheerful thought, right? Until we listen to what God says through Ezekiel the prophet. God says, "I will open your graves and I will have you rise from them. I will give you my spirit and you will live." We see that prophecy being fulfilled in today's gospel with the raising of Lazarus. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, two sisters and a brother, had a home that Jesus loved to come to. It was a place for him to just get away from the crowd, be with close friends, have a good meal, share some conversation, and then be ready to get back at it again. Well, Jesus had been told that Lazarus was sick. By the time he got there, Lazarus was dead, and he was already in the tomb for 4 days. And the gospel says that Jesus wept. He cried. And people noticing said, "Look how much he loved his friend Lazarus." Any of you who right now are mourning the loss of someone that you love, know what Jesus felt. And then Jesus, showing that he was the Lord of life, that he was stronger than death, even before his own death and resurrection, called Lazarus back to life, even before the last day. He has the stone moved away from the tomb and he says, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus got up from being dead and walked out of that tomb, and he must have looked a little odd. He was all dressed in his burial wrappings. He looked like a mummy, but he was alive. And Jesus says to the people around, "Untie him and let him go free. I will open your graves and have you rise from them. I will give you my spirit and you will live." Anna Quinlan is a novelist, and she writes about meeting someone at Coney Island Amusement Park in New York. She was out at the boardwalk, and as she sat there watching the water, a man came by and sat down near her. And she realized pretty soon on that he was a man who was homeless. And he described to Anna his schedule and how at night when the park would shut down, he would hole up in the tilt-a-whirl, or he'd go underneath the cyclone to sleep for the night. But as soon as the daylight came, he'd take his collection of newspapers that he'd found that people had left behind. He'd go to the boardwalk and he'd spend the day reading and watching the water. And when the colder weather came in, he would take those newspapers and he would use them like blankets to shield him from the cold. And Anna says to him, "Well, why don't you just go to a shelter?" And he looked at her and said, "Lady," pointing to the water, "look at the view. Look at the view." And she goes on to write that she got some new thoughts. Here was a man who didn't have a dime in his pocket, who had no home to call his own, but who loved life. And as she thought about that, She realized that with God's grace, even when life is tough, we can find meaning there. We can even find joy there. Even in spite of a failed marriage, or rejection at school, or employment worries, or mourning the loss of someone we love dearly. With God's grace, we can get through and find meaning and purpose and even joy in our living. Look at the view. Look at the view and live. A man was writing about his boyhood days, and they had a dog at home, and the dog's name was Waddles. He doesn't describe why the dog's name was Waddles, but I suspect it's because it did. He came home from school one day, and his dad was there home from work early to explain to him that dear Waddles had waddled out into the street and got hit by a car and died. And the father and the son cried together. And then they had a family funeral for Waddles in the backyard. And they buried him underneath the apple tree. And the man, remembering his boyhood days, said there were a couple of lines that his dad used when his dad preached the homily for Waddles at that family funeral in the backyard. One of them was, "Son, remember that everything we have in life, everyone we have in life, is on loan to us from God." That's a powerful insight. Everything, everyone in our life is on loan to us from God.